In a modest Miami dining room, a 72-year-old grandmother was about to silence her family's dismissive comments forever. What started as Sunday dinner took a shocking turn when they came face to face with FBI surveillance photos and federal documents. Rosa Delgado wasn't your typical abuela. For nearly a decade, she had lived as Rosa Martinez, an undercover informant infiltrating Miami's deadliest drug cartels, known for her ability to move undetected through the criminal underworld. When her grandchildren called her boring, Rosa retrieved a dusty box that would shatter every assumption about courage, revealing her past as a federal spy who had risked everything to protect them. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The aroma of ropa vieja filled Rosa Delgado's modest Miami kitchen like a warm embrace, the familiar scent of cumin and sofrito carrying decades of Sunday tradition. Steam rose from the slow cooker, where the shredded beef had been simmering since dawn, tender strands that would melt on the tongue, if anyone bothered to truly taste them anymore. Rosa moved through her kitchen with the practiced efficiency of 72 years, her weathered hands arranging the serving bowls with quiet precision. The good china, the one her Carmen had given her 5 Christmases ago, still pristine in its careful use. Each plate found its place at the dining table where 3 generations of Delgados would gather, as they had every Sunday for the past decade. "Abuela, the rice smells amazing," Miguel called from the living room, though his eyes never left his phone screen. At 14, he possessed that peculiar teenage ability to offer compliments while remaining completely absorbed in the digital world that seemed infinitely more interesting than his grandmother's kitchen. Sophia's voice carried from the same room, sharp with the particular disdain that 16-year-olds had perfected. "Do we really have to do this every single week? It's not like anything ever changes here." Rosa's hand stilled on the serving spoon. She had heard variations of this complaint before, but something in Sophia's tone, that casual dismissal, as if Rosa's efforts were nothing more than an obligation to be endured, sent a familiar ache through her chest. Carmen appeared in the kitchen doorway, her nurse's uniform replaced by weekend casual clothes, though the tired lines around her eyes remained from her double shift at Jackson Memorial. "Sophia, that's enough. Your grandmother works hard on these dinners." I know, Sophia replied, her voice carrying the exaggerated patience of someone explaining something obvious. "But honestly, Mammy, what else does she have to do? It's not like she has a job or hobbies or anything, really." The spoon clattered against the counter. Rosa steadied herself against the kitchen island, her knuckles white as she gripped the granite surface Carmen had insisted on installing last year. "To make it easier for you, Mammy," her daughter had said, not understanding that Rosa's strength had never been in question. Miguel's voice drifted over, casual and cutting. "Jeremy's grandmother went skydiving last month for her 70th birthday. Can you imagine Abuela doing anything like that?" Sophia laughed, a sound that might have been musical if it hadn't been edged with mockery. "Abuela? Please." She gets nervous when the mailman's 5 minutes late. The most exciting thing she's ever done is probably try a new recipe. Rosa began ladling the ropa vieja into the serving bowl, each movement careful and measured. The meat fell in perfect shreds, rich and dark with the sauce that had taken her years to perfect. Her mother's recipe, passed down from Cuba, adjusted and refined through decades of Sunday dinners that fewer and fewer people seemed to appreciate. "You girls don't understand," Carmen said, her voice taking on that particular tone of strained patience that mothers everywhere recognized. "Not everyone needs to go jumping out of airplanes to have a meaningful life. Your grandmother is perfectly content with simple things." Sophia finished, her voice carrying a note of finality. "Right, simple, quiet, boring things." The word hung in the air like smoke from a snuffed candle. Boring. Rosa had heard it whispered, seen it in the quick glances when they thought she wasn't looking, felt it in the way conversations stopped when she entered a room. As if her presence somehow diminished the energy, made everything less interesting. Carmen continued her defense. oblivious to the way Rosa's shoulders had tensed. There's nothing wrong with finding peace in family and home. Your grandmother has lived through things you can't imagine. She came here from Cuba with nothing, raised a family, built a life. She doesn't need to prove anything to anyone. The irony wasn't lost on Rosa. Her own daughter, defending her with words that somehow managed to be more insulting than Sophia's direct dismissal. As if Rosa were some fragile creature who needed protecting from the world's expectations, rather than someone who had once moved through that world with purpose and power. Miguel looked up from his phone for the first time that evening. I mean, I get that it was probably hard back then, but that was like forever ago. What has she done lately? The question hit Rosa like a physical blow. What had she done lately? She had tended her garden until the tomatoes grew fat and red. She had perfected the art of making Café Cubano so strong it could wake the dead. She had watched her family grow and change, and slowly, steadily, stop seeing her as anything more than a fixture in their lives. Rosa carried the serving dishes to the dining room, her movements automatic. The table was set perfectly, the way her mother had taught her in Havana when Rosa was Sophia's age, and the world still held infinite possibilities. Each fork aligned, each glass spotless, each detail attended to with the care of someone who understood that small gestures mattered. But no one noticed the table's perfection, just as they didn't notice the way Rosa had remembered Miguel's preference for extra plantains, or how she'd made Sophia's favorite dessert, even though her granddaughter rarely ate more than a few bites. The family gathered around the table with the efficiency of long practice. Carmen immediately began serving, taking over the ritual as if Rosa were incapable of completing it herself. Sophia scrolled through her phone until Carmen's sharp look made her put it away. Miguel bounced in his chair, his attention already drifting toward the video game he'd paused. "So," Carmen said, settling into her role as conversation director. "Sophia, how's the college prep going?" Sophia launched into a detailed analysis of her SAT scores and college application timeline, her voice animated in a way it never was when she spoke to Rosa directly. Miguel chimed in with stories from school, his excitement infectious when describing his latest creative writing assignment. Rosa listened, nodded at appropriate moments, and watched her family exist in a world that somehow didn't quite include her. She was the backdrop against which their lives played out, the constant that allowed them to take everything else for granted. "This is really good, Mommy," Carmen said, taking a bite of the ropa vieja. "You outdid yourself." The compliment felt hollow, automatic. Rosa had been making this exact dish for 15 years. Nothing had changed except perhaps the quality of the beef, and she'd adjusted for that. Sophia picked at her food, eating enough to avoid complaints but clearly not truly tasting it. "So, Mammy, can we maybe switch things up next week? Maybe go out somewhere? I feel like we're in such a rut." Miguel nodded enthusiastically. "Yeah, like that new fusion place downtown. They have Korean-Cuban food. Wouldn't that be exciting?" Rosa's fork paused halfway to her mouth. Exciting! There was that word again, always used in contrast to her, as if her very presence sucked the adventure out of any room. Carmen glanced at Rosa apologetically. "We could try somewhere new," she said carefully, "though you know your grandmother likes her routine." There it was again, the gentle condescension, the assumption that Rosa was too set in her ways to appreciate change. As if preferring a home-cooked meal over overpriced fusion cuisine was a character flaw rather than a choice. Sophia's voice carried a note of frustration. "I just don't understand why everything always has to be so predictable. Same food, same conversations, same everything. Don't you ever want to do anything different, abuela?" Rosa looked up from her plate, meeting her granddaughter's eyes for the first time that evening. She saw impatience there, and something that might have been pity. The look of someone resigned to accommodating an elderly relative's limitations. "Different how?" Rosa asked quietly. Sophia shrugged, her expression suggesting the question itself proved the point. "I don't know. Anything. Travel, learn something new, take risks, live a little." Miguel nodded, warming to the theme. "Like Mrs. Patterson next door. She's taking salsa lessons and learning to paint. She's like, super active for someone her age." Rosa's grip tightened on her fork. Mrs. Patterson was 63 and had moved to Miami 2 years ago after her husband's retirement. She had no family nearby, no grandchildren to watch grow up, no Sunday dinners to prepare week after week for people who increasingly saw them as obligation rather than gift. "Your grandmother has lived plenty," Carmen said, her voice taking on that defensive edge again. "She doesn't need to prove her vitality by taking dance classes." Sophia's laugh was sharp and brief. "Right, because she's so content with her quiet little life, never rocking the boat, never causing trouble, never doing anything that might surprise anyone." The words landed like stones thrown into still water, each one creating ripples that spread outward. Rosa felt something shift inside her chest, a familiar weight that she'd carried for so long she'd almost forgotten it was there, never causing trouble. If only they knew. Rosa stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the tile floor. The sound cut through the conversation like a blade, sudden and sharp. 3 pairs of eyes turned toward her, confusion replacing the easy rhythm of their chatter. "I'm going to clear these," Rosa said, though most of the plates were still full. "Mommy, we're not finished," Carmen protested. But Rosa was already moving, gathering dishes with mechanical precision. She could feel their stares, could sense the exchange of glances that asked what they'd said wrong. What had triggered this unusual display of sensitivity? In the kitchen, Rosa stacked the plates with unnecessary care, her movements slow and deliberate. She could hear them whispering in the dining room, their voices carrying the particular tone families used when discussing the unpredictable behavior of elderly relatives. Sophia's voice was the clearest, pitched just loud enough to carry. "See? This is exactly what I mean. Everything's so dramatic." Rosa's hands stilled on the dishes. Dramatic. As if having feelings about being dismissed and patronized was somehow unreasonable. As if decades of being reduced to a caricature of herself wasn't worth a moment's frustration. She walked to her bedroom, closing the door behind her with a soft click that somehow felt more final than a slam. The room was quiet, filled with the accumulated silence of all the words she'd never said, all the stories she'd never told. Rosa sat on the edge of her bed and looked toward her closet, where behind the seasonal clothes and forgotten Christmas decorations, a particular box waited in the darkness. She'd put it there 10 years ago, when Carmen had insisted on helping her organize, and Rosa had needed to keep certain things hidden. From the dining room, she could hear Carmen's voice, soothing and apologetic. "She'll be fine, you know how she gets sometimes. How she gets." As if Rosa were a weather pattern to be endured, rather than a person with legitimate feelings. Rosa stood and walked to her closet, moving aside the winter coats she rarely needed in Miami's climate. Her fingers found the familiar cardboard edges of the box that had traveled with her through 3 different homes, a constant companion she'd never been able to discard. The box was heavier than she remembered, weighed down with more than just papers and photographs. It held the proof of a life her family couldn't imagine, evidence of choices that had shaped not just her own fate, but theirs as well. She carried the box to her bed and sat down, her hands resting on its weathered surface. The voices from the dining room continued their familiar pattern of explanation and rationalization, the sound of people trying to understand something they'd never taken the time to truly see. Rosa closed her eyes and made a decision that would change everything. It was time her family learned that being underestimated was sometimes the most dangerous thing of all. She stood up, the box cradled in her arms, and walked toward the door. Behind it waited 3 people who thought they knew her story. They were about to discover they'd never heard the first chapter. Rosa's hand tightened on the cardboard box as she stood in the doorway between the hallway and living room, watching her family settle into their post-dinner routine with the comfortable predictability they had always associated with her presence. Carmen had moved to the couch, laptop balanced on her knees as she caught up on work emails with the dedication of someone who believed Sunday evening productivity could somehow prevent Monday morning chaos. Sophia sprawled across the armchair, phone held above her face as she scrolled through Instagram stories with the glazed focus of digital addiction. Miguel had claimed the floor, homework spread around him in organized chaos while he half-heartedly worked through algebra problems between glances at his sister's screen. None of them looked up when Rosa entered the room. They had grown so accustomed to her quiet presence, her unobtrusive movements through their lives, that she had become background noise, a gentle hum of domestic comfort they took for granted, like running water or electricity. She could have been carrying a bomb instead of a dusty cardboard box, and they wouldn't have noticed until it exploded in their midst. Rosa set the box carefully on the coffee table, the soft thud finally drawing their attention. The faded label R. Martinez Personal faced away from them, but even without reading it, they could sense something significant in the deliberate way she positioned it, the reverent care with which she handled what appeared to be nothing more than old storage. "What's that, Mammy?" Carmen asked, closing her laptop with the reluctant efficiency of someone interrupting important work for what was likely another family photo album or collection of outdated documents that needed sorting. "Yeah, more old stuff?" Sophia added without looking up from her phone, her tone carrying the dismissive expectation that whatever their grandmother wanted to share would be as boring as everything else about her life. Rosa sat down across from them, her weathered hands resting on top of the box like a pianist preparing to play a piece that would change everything. The cardboard felt soft beneath her palms, worn smooth by decades of careful handling during those rare moments when she had allowed herself to remember who she used to be. "You said I never did anything exciting," Rosa said quietly, her voice carrying a weight that made Carmen finally look up from her screen. "You said I was boring. Just like every other old lady." Miguel shifted uncomfortably on the floor, suddenly aware that his casual cruelty might have consequences. "Abuela, I didn't mean—" "You meant exactly what you said," Rosa interrupted, her tone gentle but firm. "And maybe it's time you learned that appearances can be deceiving." Sophia finally lowered her phone, something in her grandmother's voice triggering an instinct she didn't fully understand. The old woman sitting across from them looked the same as always. Gray hair pulled back in a neat bun, floral house dress that had probably been fashionable 30 years ago, reading glasses hanging from a chain around her neck. But there was something different in her posture, a straightness to her spine that suggested steel beneath the soft exterior. "I've been thinking about what you said at dinner," Rosa continued, her fingers tracing the edges of the box. "About wanting stories to tell your grandchildren. About wanting to have actually lived." She looked directly at Sophia, and the teenager felt a strange shiver at the intensity in her grandmother's dark eyes. "What if I told you that I have stories? What if I told you that the woman you think you know, the boring old lady who just cooks and watches telenovelas, what if she never really existed?" Carmen leaned forward, laptop forgotten. "Mommy, what are you talking about?" From the dining room, the Spanish-language news continued its evening broadcast, and Rosa heard the anchor mention Rivera's name again. The sound sent a familiar chill down her spine, the same cold fear that had kept her awake for 3 nights since Agent Chen's warning call. But mixed with the fear was something else, a strange relief at the prospect of finally laying down a burden she had carried alone for 35 years. "I'm talking about the truth," Rosa said simply. "The truth about who I really am. Who I used to be. What I did to make sure you could grow up safe and ignorant, and free to think your biggest problems were SAT scores and algebra homework." She opened the box with deliberate slowness, aware that once she revealed its contents, there would be no going back. No more comfortable lies. No more protective distance. No more boring grandmother who existed solely to cook their meals and worry about their safety from the sidelines of their busy lives. The first item she withdrew was a photograph, a professional headshot that showed a woman in her 30s, with Rosa's face, but none of her gentle demeanor. This woman's hair was perfectly styled, her makeup expertly applied, her expression confident and slightly dangerous. She wore a dress that hugged her curves and jewelry that caught the light like promises of excitement and risk. "This is Rosa Martinez," she said, placing the photograph on the coffee table where it seemed to glow under the lamplight. She worked the Miami club scene in the late 70s and early 80s. She knew all the right people, went to all the best parties, had access to circles that most people could only dream about. Sophia stared at the photograph, her mouth slightly open. The woman in the picture looked like her grandmother, but transformed, glamorous, mysterious, alive with possibilities that the Sophia had never imagined existing in the quiet woman who made her school lunches and remembered her favorite cookies. That's you?" Miguel asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "That was me," Rosa confirmed. But Rosa Martinez was more than just a party girl. She was also something else, something much more dangerous. Rosa reached into the box again and withdrew a leather folder that looked official and important. She opened it to reveal an identification card with the same woman's photograph, but this time accompanied by text that made Carmen gasp audibly. Federal Bureau of Investigation. Confidential informant. Classification level, high-value asset. The room fell into absolute silence. Even the television seemed to quiet, as if the universe itself was holding its breath for Rosa's next revelation. Rosa Martinez was an FBI informant, Rosa said, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was sharing. For 8 years, she infiltrated some of Miami's most dangerous criminal organizations. She gathered intelligence on drug trafficking operations, money laundering schemes, and political corruption that reached the highest levels of local government. Sophia's phone slipped from her suddenly nerveless fingers, clattering to the floor unnoticed. Miguel's algebra homework lay forgotten as he stared at his grandmother with the wide-eyed fascination of someone watching a magic trick that was too impossible to be real. Carmen found her voice first, though it came out as barely more than a croak. That's not possible. You worked in offices. You told me you worked in offices doing filing and bookkeeping. I told you what I needed to tell you to keep you safe, Rosa replied. The offices were cover stories, meeting places, ways to explain why I was gone so much, why I came home so late, why I sometimes had bruises or cuts that I couldn't explain. She reached into the box again and withdrew a stack of newspaper clippings, their headlines screaming about major drug busts and criminal arrests. Each article was carefully preserved, dated, and annotated in Rosa's neat handwriting. She spread them across the coffee table like tarot cards, revealing an impossible future. Major cocaine ring dismantled in dawn raids, she read from the top headline. Federal task force arrests 15 in coordinated operation. Key witness testimony leads to conviction of drug kingpin. She looked up at her family, seeing her own younger face reflected in their shocked expressions. She could feel their stares, could sense the exchange of glances that asked what they'd said wrong, what had triggered this unusual display of sensitivity. In the kitchen, Rosa stacked the plates with unnecessary care, her movements slow and deliberate. She could hear them whispering in the dining room, their voices carrying the particular tone families used when discussing the unpredictable behavior of elderly relatives. Sophia's voice was the clearest, pitched just loud enough to carry. See? This is exactly what I mean. Everything's so dramatic. Rosa's hands stilled on the dishes. Dramatic. As if having feelings about being dismissed and patronized was somehow unreasonable. As if decades of being reduced to a caricature of herself wasn't worth a moment's frustration. She walked to her bedroom, closing the door behind her with a soft click that somehow felt more final than a slam. The room was quiet, filled with the accumulated silence of all the words she'd never said, all the stories she'd never told. Rosa sat on the edge of her bed and looked toward her closet, where behind the seasonal clothes and forgotten Christmas decorations, a particular box waited in the darkness. She'd put it there 10 years ago, when Carmen had insisted on helping her organize and Rosa had needed to keep certain things hidden. From the dining room, she could hear Carmen's voice, soothing and apologetic. She'll be fine, you know how she gets sometimes, how she gets. As if Rosa were a weather pattern to be endured, rather than a person with legitimate feelings. Rosa stood and walked to her closet, moving aside the winter coats she rarely needed in Miami's climate. Her fingers found the familiar cardboard edges of the box that had traveled with her through 3 different homes, a constant companion she'd never been able to discard. The box was heavier than she remembered, weighed down with more than just papers and photographs. It held the proof of a life her family couldn't imagine, evidence of choices that had shaped not just her own fate, but theirs as well. She carried the box to her bed and sat down, her hands resting on its weathered surface. The voices from the dining room continued their familiar pattern of explanation and rationalization, the sound of people trying to understand something they'd never taken the time to truly see. Rosa closed her eyes and made a decision that would change everything. It was time her family learned that being underestimated was sometimes the most dangerous thing of all. She stood up, the box cradled in her arms, and walked toward the door. Behind it waited 3 people who thought they knew her story. They were about to discover they'd never heard the first chapter. Rosa's hand tightened on the cardboard box as she stood in the doorway between the hallway and living room, watching her family settle into their post-dinner routine with the comfortable predictability they had always associated with her presence. Carmen had moved to the couch, laptop balanced on her knees as she caught up on work emails with the dedication of someone who believed Sunday evening productivity could somehow prevent Monday morning chaos. Sophia sprawled across the armchair, phone held above her face as she scrolled through Instagram stories with the glazed focus of digital addiction. Miguel had claimed the floor, homework spread around him in organized chaos while he half-heartedly worked through algebra problems between glances at his sister's screen. I was the key witness. I was the one who provided the testimony that put these people behind bars. Miguel reached for one of the newspaper clippings with trembling fingers, his eyes scanning the details of arrests and convictions that seemed to belong to a different world. A world of danger and heroism that existed only in movies and video games, not in the quiet living room where his grandmother served cookies and helped him with homework. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. But why? Sophia asked, her voice small and confused. Why would you do something so dangerous? Rosa's expression softened, and for a moment, she looked like the grandmother they had always known. Gentle, protective, motivated by love rather than adventure. But when she spoke, her words carried the weight of experiences that had forged her into someone far more complex than they had ever imagined. Because someone had to, she said simply. Because good people were dying, and children were being destroyed, and the police couldn't get close enough to stop it. Because sometimes the only way to protect the people you love is to become someone else entirely. She reached into the box one final time and withdrew a small cassette recorder, its plastic case worn smooth by handling. This contains some of the conversations I recorded during my undercover work. Conversations with criminals discussing murders, drug shipments, plans to corrupt judges and police officers. She set it carefully beside the photographs and documents. Every word on these tapes represents a choice I made to risk my life and my family's safety for the possibility of justice. The weight of her revelations settled over the room like heavy blanket, muffling the ordinary sounds of their suburban evening and replacing them with the profound silence that follows earth-shattering truth. Carmen stared at the evidence of her mother's secret life, trying to reconcile the gentle woman who had raised her with the dangerous stranger revealed in FBI documents and surveillance photographs. Sophia picked up the glamorous headshot again, studying the confident woman who shared her grandmother's face but none of her familiar gentleness. "You were a spy," she said, her voice filled with a mixture of awe and disbelief. "I was an informant," Rosa corrected gently. "There's a difference. Spies work for their government's interests. I worked for my community's survival." But even as she made the distinction, Rosa could see the transformation beginning in her granddaughter's eyes. The shift from dismissive teenager to someone grappling with the reality that her boring grandmother had lived a life more dangerous and significant than anything Sophia had ever imagined possible. The Spanish-language news continued its evening broadcast from the next room, and Rosa heard Rivera's name mentioned again. This sound reminded her why she was finally sharing these secrets, why the comfortable lies could no longer protect her family from truths that were already catching up with them. "There's more," she said quietly, watching as her family tried to process revelations that had already shattered their understanding of who she was. Much more. And some of it might still be dangerous. The silence that followed Rosa's words was absolute. Even the air conditioning seemed to pause, as if the house itself was holding its breath. Sophia's mouth fell open, her phone slipping from nerveless fingers onto the coffee table with a soft thud. Miguel leaned forward, so far he nearly fell off the couch, his eyes fixed on the documents spread before them like artifacts from another world. Carmen sat frozen, her face cycling through disbelief, confusion, and something that might have been fear. "Mom, I don't understand. What is this? Some kind of joke?" Rosa reached into the box and withdrew a laminated identification card, sliding it across the table toward her daughter. Carmen picked it up with trembling hands. studying the photograph of a younger Rosa, hair dark and styled in soft waves, wearing a confident smile that none of them had ever seen before. Federal Bureau of Investigation, Carmen read aloud, her voice barely above a whisper. Civilian informant. Rosa Martinez. She looked up sharply. Martinez? But your maiden name was Herrera. Rosa Martinez was my cover identity, Rosa said quietly, her hands steady as she continued removing items from the box. For nearly 10 years, that's who I was when I left this house 3 nights a week. Not your mother going to her office job, not the quiet woman who made your lunch and helped with homework. I was Rosa Martinez, and Rosa Martinez moved in very different circles. Sophia found her voice first, though it came out as a croak. Cover identity? Abuela, what are you talking about? Rosa spread several black and white surveillance photographs across the table. In each one, a younger version of herself could be seen at nightclubs, restaurants, parties. Always surrounded by men in expensive suits, always laughing, always looking completely at ease in a world of danger and glamour that seemed impossible to reconcile with the woman sitting before them. These were taken by FBI surveillance teams, Rosa explained, pointing to one photograph where she stood close to a handsome man with cold eyes and gold jewelry. That's Tomas Rivera. At the time, he controlled the largest cocaine distribution network between Colombia and the eastern United States. The FBI spent 5 years trying to get close to his organization. Miguel's voice was barely audible. And you were working for the FBI? I was helping them build a case, Rosa corrected gently. I wasn't an agent. I was what they called a civilian informant. I gathered information, recorded conversations, documented meetings and transactions. Everything the FBI needed to understand how Rivera's operation worked. Carmen set down the ID card as if it had burned her fingers. This is impossible. You're telling me that while I was growing up, while you were making my breakfast and driving me to school, you were some kind of spy? Not a spy, Rosa said, though there was a flicker of something, pride, perhaps, in her voice. An informant. And yes, Carmen, while you were doing homework at this very table, I was sometimes wearing a wire to dinner parties where people discussed how many kilos of cocaine they could move through the port of Miami. Sophia grabbed one of the photographs, holding it close to her face as if proximity might make it more real. This is you? Actually you? Because this woman looks like someone from a movie. She looks dangerous. Rosa studied her granddaughter's face, seeing the struggle between disbelief and fascination. Dangerous was part of the job. Rosa Martinez had to be someone these men would trust, someone they would want to impress. She had to be charming and sophisticated and just reckless enough to fit into their world. But how? Miguel's question exploded out of him. How did you even know how to do that? How did you learn to be someone else? The FBI trained me, Rosa said simply. New clothes, new mannerisms, new backstory. Rosa Martinez was from Caracas, not Havana. She was divorced, not married. She worked in import-export, which gave her reason to travel and meet interesting people. She liked expensive restaurants and late nights, and men who could afford both. Carmen's voice was hollow. All those nights you said you were working late. All those business dinners and office parties. I was working, Rosa said. Just not the kind of work you imagined. She reached back into the box and withdrew a newspaper clipping, yellowed with age. The headline read, Major Drug Ring Dismantled in Federal Sting Operation. Below it was a smaller headline, Informant Testimony Key to Convictions. December 15, 1983, Rosa read. The day they arrested 17 members of Rivera's organization, including Rivera himself. They seized 2 tons of cocaine, $4 million in cash, and enough evidence to put most of them away for life. Sophia's eyes were wide. And you helped do that? I provided the information that made it possible, Rosa confirmed. Meeting locations, financial arrangements, shipping schedules. The FB. I knew who to watch and when to watch them because I told them. Carmen stood abruptly, pacing to the window and staring out at the quiet street where children rode bicycles and neighbors watered their lawns. I don't understand any of this. Why would you do something so dangerous? Why would you risk Why would you risk our family? Rosa was quiet for a long moment, her fingers tracing the edge of a photograph. When she spoke, her voice carried a weight that seemed to age her before their eyes. Because someone had to, she said simply. And because of Elena. Who's Elena? Miguel asked. Rosa reached for another photograph. This one not from the FBI files, but from her personal collection. It showed two young women laughing on a front porch, their arms around each other's shoulders. One was clearly Rosa, decades younger. The other was a beautiful woman with kind eyes and a radiant smile. Elena Morales was my best friend, Rosa said softly. She lived 2 houses down with her son Carlos. And she's the reason I became Rosa Martinez. She looked up at her family, seeing their confusion and growing fear. Elena was murdered because she tried to protect our neighborhood's children from drug dealers. And when I found her body, I made a promise that changed everything. The Hidden Truth, Part 4. Elena's story. Rosa held the photograph of Elena with reverent care, her thumb tracing the edge where time had begun to yellow the corners. The silence in the room felt different now, not the stunned quiet of disbelief, but the hushed anticipation of people who understood they were about to hear something that would change them. This was taken in 1976, Rosa began, her voice soft but steady. Elena had just moved to the neighborhood with her 15-year-old son Carlos. Her husband had died in a construction accident back in El Salvador, and she came here with nothing but hope and the certainty that America would give her boy a better life. Sophia leaned closer, studying the photograph. In it, both women looked impossibly young, their faces bright with the kind of optimism that hadn't yet been tested by reality. She looks happy. She was, Rosa said. Elena had this way of finding joy in everything. She could make a celebration out of a successful trip to the grocery store, turn a simple dinner into a feast just by the way she set the table. She made everyone around her feel like they mattered. Carmen sat back down, her earlier agitation replaced by a watchful stillness. What happened to her? Rosa set the photograph carefully on the coffee table, then reached for another document from the box, a police report with Elena's name typed at the top. The pages were worn from handling, as if Rosa had read them countless times over the years. By 1978, our neighborhood was changing, Rosa continued. The cocaine trade was exploding in Miami, and the dealers needed new territory. They started targeting the immigrant communities, families who were afraid to go to the police, kids who were vulnerable because their parents worked multiple jobs and couldn't always watch them. Miguel shifted uncomfortably. They were recruiting children? 15, 16-year-old boys mostly. The dealers would offer them more money in a week than their fathers made in a month. They'd give them gold chains, nice sneakers, tell them they were special. Rosa's voice hardened. They preyed on kids who felt invisible, who wanted to matter. The room felt smaller now, as if the weight of Rosa's memories was pressing against the walls. Carmen found herself thinking of her own teenage years, trying to remember if she'd ever noticed anything unusual about their quiet neighborhood. Elena saw what was happening, Rosa continued. She watched these boys, some of them barely older than her Carlos, getting pulled into something that would destroy them. And she decided to fight back. How? Sophia asked, though something in her tone suggested she wasn't sure she wanted to know. Rosa pulled out a manila folder filled with newspaper clippings, handwritten flyers, and what looked like meeting minutes. She organized the mothers. Every Tuesday night, 20 or 30 women would gather in someone's living room to talk about what they'd seen, what their children had told them. Elena documented everything: license plate numbers, descriptions of dealers, locations where transactions were happening. Carmen picked up one of the flyers, reading the Spanish text that called for community action against drug dealers. She was building evidence. She was building a movement, Rosa corrected. Elena believed that if the community stood together, if they refused to be afraid, they could protect their children. She started going to city council meetings, demanding more police patrols. She organized block watches. She even got the local priest to let her use the church basement for community meetings. Miguel was studying the police report, his young face troubled. But something went wrong. Rosa nodded slowly. The dealers warned her to stop. First, they slashed her tires. Then they broke her windows. When that didn't work, they threatened Carlos directly, followed him home from school, cornered him at the bus stop, made it clear that his mother's activities were putting him in danger. And she stopped? Sophia asked hopefully. She doubled down, Rosa said, and for the first time since she'd opened the box, she smiled, a fierce expression that transformed her face entirely. Elena Morales had not come all the way from El Salvador to watch her son get destroyed by the same violence she'd fled. She started keeping a gun in her purse. She convinced 3 other mothers to go to the police with her to file formal complaints. She even reached out to a reporter at the Miami Herald who was investigating corruption in the police department. Carmen felt a chill creeping up her spine. "Mom, where's this going?" Rosa's smile faded. March 23, 1979. I was making dinner when I heard Carlos screaming. Not the kind of scream you hear when a child falls off their bicycle, the kind that comes from somewhere deeper than physical pain. The silence stretched until Miguel broke it with a whispered, "What happened?" I ran outside and found him on Elena's front porch, kneeling next to her body. She'd been shot 3 times in the chest as she got out of her car, coming home from the grocery store. Rosa's voice remained steady, but her hands had begun to tremble slightly. The milk was still spilling from the torn bag onto the driveway. Sophia made a small sound of distress. Carmen reached over and took her mother's hand, feeling how cold Rosa's fingers had become. "The police said it was a robbery gone wrong," Rosa continued. "They pointed out that her purse was missing, that this kind of random violence was becoming more common in the area. They took statements, filed their report, and essentially closed the case within a week." "But you didn't believe them," Carmen said quietly. Rosa met her daughter's eyes. 2 days after Elena's funeral, Carlos came to see me. He was packing to go live with relatives in California. Couldn't stand to stay in the house where his mother died. Before he left, he gave me something Elena had hidden in her bedroom. She reached into the box one final time and withdrew a small notebook, its pages filled with Elena's careful handwriting. Her real evidence. Names, dates, transactions she'd witnessed. And at the very back, a list of people she suspected were being paid to look the other way. Miguel leaned forward. "Cops." "Cops, city officials, even some federal agents," Rosa confirmed. Elena had been building a case that went far beyond street-level dealers. She'd uncovered a network of corruption that reached into the highest levels of local government. The notebook seemed to pulse with dangerous knowledge as it sat on the coffee table among the photographs and documents. "That's when I knew," Rosa said softly. Elena had died because she'd gotten too close to the truth, and unless someone continued her work, unless someone made sure her death meant something, those children she'd died trying to protect would be lost forever. She looked at each of her family members in turn. "So I called the FBI." Rosa reached back into the box and withdrew a business card, yellowed with age but still readable. The FBI seal was embossed in one corner, and below it, in neat black type, Agent David Chen, Federal Bureau of Investigation. "I called the number on a Tuesday morning," Rosa said, turning the card over in her fingers. "Carmen was at school. Eduardo was at work. I sat at this very kitchen table with Elena's notebook spread in front of me and dialed before I could lose my nerve." Sophia picked up the business card, studying it as if it might reveal some secret about how an ordinary grandmother had transformed into a federal informant. "What did you say?" "I told them I had information about police corruption and drug trafficking in my neighborhood. I said my friend had been murdered for trying to expose it." Rosa's voice grew distant, as if she were reliving that phone call across the decades. "The woman who answered transferred me 3 times before I finally reached Agent Chen." Carmen shook her head slowly. "I can't imagine you making that call. You've always been so careful, so afraid of drawing attention." "I was terrified," Rosa admitted, "but I was angrier than I was afraid." Elena had died believing that someone would continue her work, that her death would mean something. I couldn't let her be wrong. Miguel leaned forward, his teenage fascination with the spy elements of the story evident in his bright eyes. "So what happened? Did they believe you?" Rosa smiled at the memory. Agent Chen was 28 years old and had been with the Bureau for exactly 18 months. He was eager, ambitious, and convinced that a major case would make his career. When I showed him Elena's notebook, when he saw the level of detail she'd compiled, he knew he'd found something significant. She pulled out another photograph, this one showing a young Asian American man in a dark suit, standing next to Rosa outside what appeared to be a government building. Both looked serious, professional, like partners embarking on a dangerous mission. He explained that they'd been investigating Tomas Rivera's organization for 2 years, without making any real progress. Rivera was smart, paranoid, and surrounded himself with people who'd known each other for decades. They couldn't get anyone inside. "But they could get you inside," Carmen said quietly, understanding beginning to dawn in her voice. "They could try," Rosa corrected. Agent Chen was honest about the risks. He told me that most civilian informants gathered information from the periphery, overheard conversations, observed meetings from a distance. What they needed was someone who could get close to Rivera himself, someone he would trust with sensitive information. Sophia set down the business card, her expression troubled. "How could they ask you to do something that dangerous? You had a family." "They didn't ask," Rosa said firmly. "I volunteered. When Agent Chen explained what they needed, I told him I wanted to do it. Elena's death had shown me that staying safe, keeping quiet, protecting only my own family wasn't enough. The corruption was spreading, more children were being recruited, more families were being destroyed." She reached for a manila envelope and withdrew what looked like a professional headshot, the kind of photograph used for corporate brochures or magazine profiles. The woman in the picture was unmistakably Rosa, but transformed. Her hair was styled in an elegant bob, her makeup was expertly applied, and she wore a silk blouse that probably cost more than Rosa's family spent on groceries in a month. "This is Rosa Martinez," she said, sliding the photograph across the table. "The FBI gave me a complete background. Born in Caracas, moved to Miami in 1975, divorced from a wealthy businessman who'd left her comfortable, but not wealthy enough to maintain her previous lifestyle." Miguel picked up the photo, comparing it to the older woman sitting across from him. "You look like a completely different person." "I had to be," Rosa explained. Rosa Delgado was a devoted wife and mother who worked as a secretary and lived quietly in Coral Gables. Rosa Martinez was sophisticated, a little reckless, attracted to excitement and men who could provide it. She frequented the expensive restaurants and nightclubs where Rivera's associates conducted business. Carmen's voice was barely above a whisper. "How did you learn to be her?" 3 months of intensive preparation, Rosa said. "The FBI rented an apartment downtown where I could practice being Rosa Martinez. They taught me about cocaine trafficking, money laundering, the hierarchy of criminal organizations. I learned to recognize different types of drugs, understand street prices, identify the signs of someone carrying a weapon." She paused, her fingers tracing the edge of the photograph. "But the hardest part wasn't learning about crime. It was learning to be someone who moved confidently in that world." Rosa Martinez had to be the kind of woman who could walk into an exclusive nightclub alone and within an hour be invited to a private party with dangerous men. "That's impossible," Sophia said flatly. You're not." She stopped, realizing how her words might sound. Rosa laughed, a sound that held no bitterness despite her granddaughter's obvious struggle to reconcile the elegant woman in the photograph with the grandmother who made Sunday dinners and worried about everyone wearing sweaters when it got cold. "You're right," Rosa said gently. "Rosa Delgado couldn't have done it. But Rosa Martinez could, because Rosa Martinez was everything I'd never allowed myself to be. She was confident, flirtatious, unafraid to take risks. She could drink whiskey without wincing and laugh at jokes that weren't funny if they came from the right person." Miguel was studying the headshot with newfound respect. "So you basically became an actress." "A method actress," Rosa corrected. "Because the performance had to be perfect every single time. One mistake. One moment where Rosa Martinez slipped and Rosa Delgado showed through. Could have gotten me killed." She looked around at her family, seeing their struggle to understand how the woman they'd dismissed as boring and conventional had possessed the courage and skill to transform herself so completely. The first time I walked into Club Tropicana wearing a dress that cost more than our monthly mortgage payment, I was so nervous I could barely breathe. Rosa continued. But I remembered Elena, remembered the children in our neighborhood who were being destroyed while adults looked the other way, and I became someone who could save them. Carmen's question came out in a rush. What about us? What about Dad and me? How did you manage to be two different people? Rosa's expression grew somber. That, she said quietly, was the hardest part of all. Rosa reached for a particular photograph from the bottom of the box, handling it as if it might burn her fingers. The image showed her at what appeared to be an elegant party. Crystal chandeliers, men in expensive suits, women dripping with jewelry. But Rosa's smile in the photograph looked forced, her eyes holding a tension that hadn't been visible in the earlier pictures. This was taken at Rivera's penthouse in October of 1982, she said quietly. 3 years into my undercover work, 6 months before the arrests. By then, Rosa Martinez had become exactly what we'd hoped. Someone Rivera trusted. Someone he invited to his most private gatherings. Sophia leaned closer, studying the photograph. You look scared. I was terrified, Rosa admitted. Because that night, Rivera had become convinced there was an informant in his organization. Someone had leaked information about a shipment from Colombia, and $20 million worth of cocaine had been seized by the Coast Guard. Miguel's eyes widened. Did he suspect you? He suspected everyone, Rosa said. Rivera was paranoid by nature, but when he lost that much money, that paranoia became deadly. He spent the entire evening watching his associates, looking for signs of betrayal, testing loyalties in ways that... She paused, her hands tightening on the photograph. In ways that required me to make choices I still have nightmares about. Carmen's voice was strained. What kind of choices? Rosa set the photograph down and reached for another document, this one bearing the FBI seal and marked "Confidential" in red letters across the top. Agent Chen had given me strict instructions about maintaining my cover. No matter what I witnessed, no matter what happened, I couldn't break character unless my life was in immediate danger. The mission was too important, the potential arrests too valuable. She looked up at her family, and for the first time since opening the box, her composure seemed to crack slightly. That night, Rivera decided to test everyone's loyalty by having them participate in disciplining someone he suspected of betraying him. The room grew very quiet. Even the sounds from the street outside seemed to fade away. There was a man named Santos, one of Rivera's mid-level dealers who'd been skimming money from cocaine sales. Rivera had discovered the theft earlier that day, and he wanted to make an example. Rosa's voice became mechanical, as if she were reading from a police report rather than recounting her own memories. They brought Santos to the penthouse, and Rivera announced that anyone who wanted to remain part of his organization had to prove their loyalty. Miguel swallowed hard. Prove it how? By participating in Santos's punishment, Rosa said simply. Everyone in that room, 15 people, including me, was handed a wooden baseball bat. Sophia made a small sound of horror. Carmen had gone completely pale. I stood there holding that bat, wearing Rosa Martinez's expensive dress and jewelry, surrounded by people I'd been gathering evidence against for 3 years, Rosa continued. Santos was on his knees in the middle of the room, bleeding from where Rivera had already struck him, begging for mercy. And I had to decide whether to blow my cover to save one man, or maintain my identity to eventually save hundreds of children from the drugs his organization was pushing. What did you do? Carmen whispered. Rosa closed her eyes for a moment. I participated enough to satisfy Rivera without causing permanent damage. I aimed for Santos's legs, his arms, areas that would hurt but heal. Other people weren't so careful. She opened her eyes, meeting her daughter's horrified gaze. Santos survived, but he was never the same. And for the rest of my time undercover, I carried the knowledge that I had helped hurt an innocent man to maintain a lie. The silence stretched until Miguel found his voice. But you saved more people by staying undercover, right? The mission was worth it? That's what I told myself every night when I came home to this house, Rosa said. That's what Agent Chen told me during our debriefings. That the greater good required individual sacrifices, that the children we would save justified the compromises we made. She pulled out another photograph, this one showing her laughing with a group of well-dressed men at what appeared to be a restaurant. One of the men had his arm around her shoulders in a gesture that looked disturbingly intimate. "This is Carlos Mendoza," she said, pointing to the man beside her. "He ran Rivera's money laundering operation through a chain of legitimate businesses, restaurants, dry cleaners, import companies. For almost a year, I cultivated a relationship with him, let him believe we were romantically involved, encouraged him to trust me with information about the financial side of the operation." Sophia stared at the photograph. "You mean you? You pretended to date him?" "Rosa Martinez dated him," Rosa corrected carefully. "She went to dinner with him twice a week, attended social events as his companion, even traveled with him to the Bahamas on what he thought was a romantic weekend, but was actually a business trip to set up offshore accounts." Carmen's voice was tight with emotion. "While you were married to Dad, while I was married to your father, while you were at home doing homework while I was supposed to be working late at the office," Rosa confirmed. "Carlos was a charming man, intelligent, funny when he wasn't discussing how to hide drug money from federal investigators. Under different circumstances, I might have genuinely liked him. But you were lying to him," Miguel said, though he sounded more fascinated than judgmental. "I was lying to everyone," Rosa said. "To Carlos, to Rivera, to all of Rivera's associates who thought I was their friend. Some of these people invited me to their children's birthday parties, their family celebrations. They trusted me with their secrets, their fears, their dreams for their families' futures. And the entire time, I was documenting everything they said for the FBI." She reached for a small tape recorder from the box, old-fashioned and clunky by modern standards. "I wore a wire to every social event, every dinner, every private conversation. This device was sewn into the lining of my purses, hidden in jewelry, concealed in the heels of my shoes. For 3 years, I never had a conversation as Rosa Martinez that wasn't being recorded." Carmen stood up abruptly and walked to the window, her back to the family. "I can't listen to any more of this." "Carmen," Rosa began. "No," Carmen said, her voice shaking. "I can't process this. You're telling me that while I was a teenager, while I thought my mother was working as a secretary and coming home late because of overtime, you were actually living some kind of double life with drug dealers and criminals. You were lying to dangerous people, putting yourself at risk, putting our family at risk." Rosa set down the tape recorder, her hands steady despite the tremor in her daughter's voice. "You're right. I was putting you at risk. Every day for 3 years, I came home knowing that if my cover was blown, if someone discovered who I really was, Rivera's people would come for our family." Miguel's question was barely audible. "Did they ever suspect? Did you ever almost get caught?" Rosa's smile was grim. "More times than I care to remember. But there was one night, about a month before the arrests, when I came closer to being discovered than ever before. And that night changed everything." Carmen turned back from the window, her face streaked with tears she hadn't realized she was shedding. "Tell me about that night. The night you almost got caught. I need to understand what you risked, what you put us through." Rosa's hand stilled on the contents of the box. She looked older suddenly, as if the weight of these memories was pressing down on her shoulders like a physical burden. November 18th, 1982. A Thursday. You had a school play that night. You were playing Maria in West Side Story. You'd been practicing for months. The specificity of the memory hit Carmen like a blow. "I remember that play. You missed it. You said you had to work late, that there was an emergency at the office." Her voice broke slightly. "I kept looking for you in the audience, even during my solos. I thought maybe you'd surprise me and show up anyway. I wanted to be there more than anything in the world," Rosa said quietly. "But that night, Rivera was hosting a meeting at his private club, one of the most important gatherings I'd ever been invited to. Colombian suppliers were flying in to negotiate a new distribution agreement. The FBI had been trying to document this connection for years. Sophia looked between her grandmother and her mother, beginning to understand the true cost of Rosa's heroism. So you chose the mission over your daughter. I chose to prevent thousands of children from being poisoned by the drugs that meeting would bring to our streets. Rosa corrected, though her voice held no defensiveness, only exhaustion. But yes, that meant missing the most important night of Carmen's junior year. Miguel shifted uncomfortably. What happened at the meeting? Rosa pulled out a small notebook, its pages filled with her careful handwriting in tiny script. Everything was going perfectly. I was wearing a wire hidden in my necklace, positioned at a table where I could hear every word. The Colombians were discussing shipping routes, payment schedules, quantities that would have tripled Rivera's operation. She paused, her finger tracing a particular page in the notebook. But then Rivera's security chief, a man named Jorge Vasquez, started asking questions. He'd noticed that several shipments had been intercepted in the past few months, always at times and locations that had been discussed at gatherings where I was present. Carmen sat back down, her anger temporarily displaced by fear for her mother's past self. He suspected you. He suspected everyone, but yes, his attention was focused on me that night. He started asking Rosa Martinez detailed questions about her background, questions the FBI hadn't prepared me for. Rosa's voice grew tense with the memory. He wanted to know the name of my divorce lawyer in Caracas, the address of the import company I'd supposedly worked for, the maiden name of my ex-husband's mother. Details that would be impossible to fake, Miguel realized. Exactly. And while I was trying to deflect his questions without appearing suspicious, one of Rivera's men brought him a photograph. Rosa reached into the box and withdrew a surveillance photo, but this one wasn't taken by the FBI. It showed Rosa in her real life, wearing a simple dress and standing outside Carmen's school at a parent-teacher conference. The room went dead silent. Someone had been watching our family, Rosa said simply, following our real lives, documenting who Rosa Delgado actually was. And that night, Jorge Vasquez laid that photograph on the table in front of everyone and asked Rosa Martinez to explain why she looked exactly like the wife of Eduardo Delgado, who lived in Coral Gables and worked as a secretary at Henderson Insurance. Sophia's hand flew to her mouth. Oh my God, they knew. Jorge knew, Rosa corrected, but Rivera didn't want to believe it. I had been feeding him valuable intelligence about rival organizations, helping him expand his territory, warning him about police investigations that weren't related to our case. To him, I was an asset worth protecting. Carmen's voice was barely a whisper. What did you do? Rosa smiled grimly. I did what Rosa Martinez would do. I laughed. I picked up that photograph and studied it like I was seeing myself for the first time. And I said, she's pretty, but honey, do you really think I'd be caught dead in a dress that cheap? Despite everything, Miguel almost smiled. That worked? It bought me time, Rosa said. I told them the woman in the photo was probably my cousin. We'd always looked alike, and our family had scattered all over Florida after coming from Venezuela. It was plausible enough that Rivera wanted to believe it. She reached for another document, this one bearing urgent handwriting in red ink. But I knew my time was running out. That night, I went to the bathroom and managed to signal my FBI contact. I told Agent Chen that my cover was compromised, and I needed to be extracted immediately. Carmen leaned forward. So you came home? You ended it? Rosa's expression darkened. Agent Chen told me I had to stay. We were 2 weeks away from having enough evidence to arrest Rivera's entire leadership. 2 weeks away from the biggest drug bust in Miami history. He said if I disappeared suddenly, it would confirm Jorge's suspicions and the entire investigation would be worthless. The weight of that decision settled over the room like a shroud, so I stayed, Rosa continued. For 2 more weeks, I attended parties and dinners with people who were actively investigating whether I was a federal informant. I smiled and laughed and played Rosa Martinez while Jorge Vasquez and his men gathered more evidence about my real identity. Sophia's eyes were wide with horror. They could have killed you at any moment. They almost did. Rosa admitted. 3 days before the arrests, Jorge came to my apartment, Rosa Martinez's apartment downtown, at 2 o'clock in the morning. He said he wanted to talk privately, just the two of us. Miguel swallowed hard. And you let him in? I had to. Refusing would have been as good as confessing. Rosa's hands trembled slightly as she spoke. He sat in my living room for 3 hours, asking questions, showing me more photographs of our family, describing your daily routines in detail. He knew what time Carmen caught the bus to school, what grocery store I shopped at, which church we attended on Sundays. Carmen made a small sound of distress. He was threatening us. He was making it clear that my family's safety depended on my honesty, Rosa confirmed. And that's when I realized the true cost of what I'd been doing. Not just the lies, not just the danger to myself, but the knowledge that my choices had put my daughter, had put you, Carmen, in the crosshairs of very dangerous people. The room fell silent except for the sound of Carmen's quiet crying. That night, Rosa said softly, after Jorge finally left, I sat in that apartment that wasn't really mine, wearing clothes that belonged to a woman who didn't really exist, and I called this house. It was 3:30 in the morning. Carmen looked up sharply. I remember that call. You said you were working late, that you'd be home soon. But your voice sounded different. I needed to hear your voice, Rosa said simply. I needed to know you were safe, that you were real, that Rosa Delgado's life was still there waiting for me. And when you answered the phone, sounding sleepy and annoyed that I'd woken you up, it was the most beautiful sound I'd ever heard. Miguel's question was gentle. Did you tell her you loved her? Rosa nodded. I told you I loved you, Carmen, and you said, I love you too, Mom, but why are you being so weird? Just come home already. Carmen was crying openly now. I was so tired of you being gone all the time. I thought you didn't want to be around us, that work was more important than family. Work was more important, Rosa said quietly. But not because I didn't love you, because I loved you so much that I was willing to sacrifice our relationship to keep you safe from the world I was documenting. Every night I spent as Rosa Martinez was a night I wasn't home to tuck you in, to help with homework, to hear about your day. But it was also a night that brought us closer to ending Rivera's operation, to removing that threat from our community. Sophia wiped her eyes. Did Jorge ever figure out the truth? Rosa reached for the final document in the box, a newspaper dated December 15, 1982, with the headline she'd shown them earlier about Rivera's arrest. Jorge Vasquez was arrested at his home at 6 o'clock in the morning, 2 days after he'd sat in my apartment threatening my family. He never got the chance to expose me. She looked around at her family, seeing their tears, their understanding, their newfound respect for the impossible choices she'd made. But the damage was already done, Rosa said softly. The distance I'd created to protect you, Carmen, the walls I'd built between Rosa Delgado and Rosa Martinez, they didn't come down when the mission ended. For years afterward, I struggled to be the mother you needed, because I'd spent so long being someone else entirely. Carmen reached across the table and took her mother's hand. I thought you didn't love me enough. All these years I thought I wasn't important to you. Rosa squeezed her daughter's fingers. You were so important to me that I was willing to become someone I barely recognized to keep you safe. But I never learned how to tell you that. And by the time I tried, the pattern was set. You saw me as distant, uninvolved, content with simple things. Miguel looked at the newspaper headline. So it worked? You got them all? We got them all, Rosa confirmed. Rivera, Jorge, Carlos, the Colombian suppliers, 17 people total. But there's something else you need to know. Something that makes this conversation more than just family history. Sophia felt a chill. What do you mean? Rosa met her granddaughter's eyes. Tomas Rivera was released from federal prison 6 weeks ago. The words hung in the air like a physical presence. Sophia's face went pale. Miguel gripped the edge of the coffee table, and Carmen's hand tightened convulsively around Rosa's fingers. Released? Carmen's voice cracked. After 30 years, they just let him out? Rosa reached for a manila envelope that had been tucked beneath the other documents. Good behavior, overcrowding in the federal prison system, and an expensive legal team that found technicalities in his original sentencing. She withdrew several newspaper clippings, all dated within the past 2 months. The Miami Herald covered his release. Local news stations ran stories about his parole conditions. Miguel leaned over to read one of the headlines. Cocaine kingpin released after 3 decades behind bars. Below it was a photograph of an older man with silver hair and cold eyes, walking out of what appeared to be a federal facility flanked by lawyers. He looks... Sophia paused, searching for the right word. Normal, like somebody's grandfather. Tomas Rivera is 74 years old now, Rosa said quietly. He's supposedly in poor health, confined to a wheelchair, requiring constant medical care. According to his parole agreement, he's living in a supervised facility in Orlando and isn't allowed to travel outside a 50-mile radius without federal approval. Carmen studied the photograph with the expression of someone trying to recognize a monster in human form. But you don't believe that's the end of it. 2 weeks ago, I received a phone call, Rosa said, her voice taking on a clinical tone that didn't match the fear in her eyes. Agent Chen, my old handler, is retired now but still has contacts in the bureau. He called to warn me that Rivera had been asking questions about his old case, specifically about the informants who had helped convict him. The room felt smaller suddenly, as if the walls were pressing in around them. Miguel's question came out as a whisper. Does he know it was you? Rosa pulled out another document, this one bearing the current FBI seal and marked with yesterday's date. According to federal intelligence, Rivera has been using intermediaries to research the identities of everyone who testified at his trial. Court records were sealed, but money and connections can unseal a lot of things. Sophia was reading over Miguel's shoulder, her voice tight with fear. This says he's been in contact with former associates, people who weren't arrested in the original bust. Jorge Vasquez died in prison in 1995, Rosa said. But Carlos Mendoza, the man I dated as Rosa Martinez, was released 8 years ago. He's been living quietly in Tampa, running a legitimate restaurant business. Until 3 weeks ago, when he received a visit from 2 men asking questions about Rosa Martinez. Carmen stood up abruptly, pacing to the window again. They're hunting you. After all these years, they're actually hunting you. They're trying to confirm what Jorge suspected 40 years ago, Rosa corrected. Carlos told the men he barely remembered Rosa Martinez, that she'd disappeared from his life around the time of the arrests, and he'd assumed she'd fled the country. But Agent Chen thinks Rivera isn't satisfied with that answer. Miguel's hands were shaking as he set down the newspaper clipping. What does this mean for us? For our family? Rosa reached for the most recent document in the envelope, a letter bearing the FBI letterhead and Agent Chen's signature. It means that the Bureau believes Rivera poses a credible threat to my safety, and by extension to the safety of my family. They've offered to relocate me to a safe house until they can assess the level of danger. And you said no, Carmen said, turning back from the window. It wasn't a question. I said no, Rosa confirmed. I've spent 40 years building a life as Rosa Delgado. I've watched you grow up, Carmen. I've been there for Sophia's first steps, Miguel's first day of school. I'm not going to let an old man's revenge fantasies take that away from me. Sophia's voice was small, scared. But what if he finds out for sure? What if he comes after us? Rosa met her granddaughter's eyes with a steadiness that reminded everyone in the room why she'd been successful as an undercover informant. Then we'll be ready. She reached into the box one final time and withdrew what appeared to be a modern smartphone, sleek and expensive looking. Agent Chen insisted I carry this. It has a direct line to federal marshals, GPS tracking, and a panic button that will bring armed agents to our location within minutes. Miguel stared at the device. That's like something from a spy movie. The reality of being threatened by organized crime is much less glamorous than the movies suggest, Rosa said dryly. It mostly involves being very careful about your routines, staying aware of your surroundings, and having contingency plans for situations you hope will never occur. Carmen returned to her seat, her expression shifting from fear to determination. What kind of contingency plans? Rosa pulled out a handwritten list, her careful script covering both sides of a piece of paper. No one leaves the house alone after dark. We vary our routes to work and school. Sophia and Miguel don't post location information on social media. We've installed a security system that connects directly to the police department. This is insane, Sophia said. though her voice held more awe than protest. "We're living like we're in witness protection." Quote dot. "We're living like people who understand that some threats don't disappear just because time passes," Rosa corrected. Rivera spent 30 years in prison nursing his hatred for the people who destroyed his empire. That kind of anger doesn't fade, it ferments. Miguel was studying the security recommendations with the focused attention of someone trying to memorize emergency procedures. "How long do we have to live like this?" Agent Chen believes that if Rivera was going to act on his suspicions, he would do it quickly, Rosa said. "The longer he waits, the more attention he draws from federal investigators who are already monitoring him closely. If nothing happens in the next few months, the threat level will probably decrease significantly." Carmen's laugh held no humor. "So we just wait and see if a drug lord decides to have us killed. This is what our lives have become because of choices you made 40 years ago." The accusation hung in the air between them. Rosa didn't flinch from it. "Yes," she said simply. "This is what our lives have become, because 40 years ago, I chose to help the FBI bring down a criminal organization that was destroying our community. The same choice that removed tons of cocaine from the streets, that prevented countless children from being recruited as drug dealers, that broke up a network of corruption that reached into the highest levels of local government." She looked around at each member of her family. "I can't apologize for that choice, even though it's putting you at risk now. But I can promise that I'll do everything in my power to keep you safe from the consequences." Sophia picked up Agent Chen's business card, studying it with new understanding. "When was the last time you talked to him?" "Yesterday," Rosa said. "He's flying down from Washington tomorrow to brief the family personally. He wants to explain the threat assessment and review our security protocols." Miguel's eyes widened. "He's coming here? To our house?" "Agent Chen feels it's important that you understand the situation fully," Rosa said. "That you know this isn't just your grandmother's paranoia or guilt from her past. This is a legitimate federal investigation into credible threats against our family." Carmen was quiet for a long moment, processing everything they'd learned. When she finally spoke, her voice was steadier than it had been all afternoon. "Tell me what we need to do," she said. "Tell me how we keep my children safe." Rosa smiled for the first time since opening the box, an expression of fierce pride and gratitude. "We start by understanding that the Delgado family is stronger than Tomas Rivera ever imagined. Then we make sure he learns that threatening us was the biggest mistake he's made since underestimating Rosa Martinez." Outside, the afternoon shadows were growing longer, and somewhere in the distance, the sound of children playing in the street provided a normalcy that felt both precious and fragile. Tomorrow, Agent Chen would arrive to transform their suburban home into a fortress of federal protection. But tonight, for the first time in 40 years, Rosa Delgado was no longer carrying her secrets alone. The Hidden Truth, Part 9, Agent Chen's Visit. The doorbell rang at precisely 2 o'clock on Monday afternoon, causing everyone in the Delgado house to freeze momentarily. Rosa had been pacing the living room for the past hour, periodically adjusting the placement of documents on the coffee table and checking her watch. Carmen sat rigidly on the couch, while Sophia and Miguel flanked her like bookends, both having insisted on staying home from school despite Rosa's protests. "That's him," Rosa said quietly, smoothing down her blouse, a gesture that revealed more nervousness than she'd shown during 2 days of revelations about drug lords and federal investigations. Through the front window, they could see a silver sedan parked at the curb and a tall, gray-haired Asian man in a dark suit walking up their front path. Carmen leaned forward. "What do you mean?" Chen touched the screen, bringing up a different document, one that showed Rosa's photograph alongside official FBI commendations and case statistics. "Your mother was the single most valuable civilian asset in the history of the Miami Field Office's Organized Crime Division. The intelligence she provided didn't just help us arrest Rivera's immediate organization. It dismantled an entire network of corruption that extended into city government, local police, and even some federal agencies." Sophia stared at the screen. "Abuela was like a super spy?" "Your grandmother was an extraordinary woman who chose to risk everything for her community," Chen said simply, "and Rivera knows it. During his imprisonment, he had access to court transcripts, FBI case files that became public record during appeals processes, and information from other inmates who had worked with his organization. Miguel swallowed hard. So he knows it was her. He suspects, Chen corrected. But suspicion and certainty are different things, and that difference is what's keeping your family relatively safe right now. He pulled up another screen showing surveillance footage from various locations around Miami. Rivera's parole conditions prohibit him from traveling outside Orlando, but that doesn't prevent him from sending people to gather information. We've documented contact between Rivera and at least 6 individuals who have subsequently been observed in the Miami area. Carmen's voice was tight. Observed doing what? Reconnaissance, Chen said bluntly. Visiting locations where Rosa Martinez was known to frequent in the 1980s. Talking to people who might remember her. Researching property records and family information. He looked directly at Rosa. 3 days ago, someone fitting the description of one of Rivera's associates was seen photographing this house from the street. The room went silent except for the sound of Miguel's sharp intake of breath. "Why didn't you tell me?" Rosa asked, though her voice held no accusation, only the weariness of someone who had been expecting this news. "Because we apprehended him before he could gather any useful intelligence," Chen replied. Local police picked him up for questioning under the pretense of investigating suspicious activity in the neighborhood. He had photographs of your house, Carmen's workplace, and Sophia's school. Sophia made a small sound of distress. Carmen reached over and took her daughter's hand. "What did you do with him?" Rosa asked. "We explained very clearly that continuing to gather information about your family would constitute harassment and stalking, which would violate his own parole conditions," Chen said with the kind of neutral tone that suggested the conversation had been less polite than his words implied. He took the first flight back to Orlando that evening. Miguel was studying the surveillance footage with morbid fascination, but there could be others, right? Other people working for Rivera? Absolutely, Chen confirmed. Which is why I'm here to discuss enhanced security measures with your family. He pulled up a new screen showing what appeared to be a comprehensive security assessment of their neighborhood. The good news is that your current precautions are excellent. The security system Rosa installed is military-grade. Your varied daily routines make surveillance difficult, and your social media discipline has been impressive. Sophia looked slightly guilty. I deleted all my location tags like abuela asked. The less good news, Chen continued, is that determined professionals can overcome those precautions given enough time and resources. Rivera may be old and confined to a wheelchair, but he still has access to significant financial resources and connections to people who specialize in finding information. Carmen stood up and walked to the window, peering through the blinds at their quiet suburban street. "So what do you recommend? What more can we do?" Chen touched the tablet screen again, bringing up what appeared to be a federal protection protocol. "The Bureau is prepared to offer your family temporary relocation to a safe house facility while we determine the full extent of Rivera's intentions." "Absolutely not," Rosa said immediately. "Rosa," Chen began, "I'm not running away from my life because an old man wants revenge for crimes he committed 40 years ago," Rosa said firmly. "I'm not letting him win by forcing me to abandon everything I've built since then." Chen nodded, as if he'd expected this response. "In that case, we implement enhanced in-place protection. 24-hour surveillance of your property, undercover agents positioned throughout your daily routines, and immediate response protocols if any threats escalate." Miguel's eyes went wide. "Like bodyguards?" "Like invisible bodyguards," Chen corrected. "People you'll never see but who will always be watching. Your lives continue normally, but with a safety net you're not aware of." Sophia looked between Chen and Rosa. "How long would this last?" "Until Rivera either acts on his suspicions, at which point we arrest him for violating parole, or until the investigation determines he's moved on to other concerns," Chen said. "Based on psychological profiles and past behavior patterns, we estimate 3 to 6 months." Carmen returned from the window, her expression determined. "And if he does try something? If he actually comes after us?" Chen's smile was grim but confident. Then he discovers that threatening the family of a federal informant brings the full weight of the United States government down on his head. Rivera may have been powerful in the 1980s, but he's a 74-year-old ex-convict going up against the modern FBI. It wouldn't be much of a contest. Rosa reached over and took Chen's hand, a gesture that surprised everyone, including Chen himself. "David, I need you to be honest with me. Not Agent Chen talking to a former asset, but David talking to Rosa. Do you really think he'll try something?" Chen was quiet for a moment, considering his words carefully. "Honestly, I think Rivera is dying. His medical records suggest advanced heart disease, possible liver complications from decades of alcohol abuse. He probably has months, not years. And dying men sometimes do desperate things to settle old scores." The weight of that assessment settled over the room. "But," Chen continued, "I also think he's smart enough to know that harming you or your family would accomplish nothing, except ensuring he spends his final days in federal custody. The question is whether his need for revenge is stronger than his sense of self-preservation." Miguel looked around at his family. His grandmother, who had lived a double life for years, his mother, who was processing decades of misunderstood distance, his sister, who was grappling with having a genuinely dangerous grandmother instead of a boring one. "So we wait," he said quietly. "We live with bodyguards we can't see and try to act normal while a drug lord decides whether to kill us." Chen's expression softened with something like sympathy. "I know it's not fair. Rosa made choices 40 years ago that were necessary and heroic, and now her family has to live with consequences they never chose. But I promise you this. We will not let Rivera hurt you. Your grandmother put her life on the line to serve her country, and her country will not abandon her now." Rosa squeezed Chen's hand, then released it. "Thank you, David. For everything. Then and now." Chen nodded and began packing up his tablet. "I'll have agents in position by tomorrow morning. You won't see them, but they'll be there. And Rosa." He paused at the door. "For what it's worth, what you accomplished in those 3 years changed everything. Not just Rivera's organization, but the entire landscape of organized crime in South Florida. Hundreds of families are safer because of your courage." After Chen left, the family sat in Rosa's living room surrounded by the evidence of her extraordinary past and the reality of their uncertain present. The afternoon light streaming through the windows seemed different somehow. Less innocent, more watchful. But they were together, and they were no longer carrying secrets that divided them. Whatever came next, they would face it as a family that finally understood its own strength. The afternoon sun was beginning to fade when Agent Chen's silver sedan disappeared around the corner, leaving the Delgado family alone with the weight of everything they'd learned. Rosa sat in her favorite armchair, the one Eduardo had bought for their 20th anniversary, surrounded by the scattered documents of her secret life. The box that had held 40 years of hidden truth now sat empty on the coffee table, its contents spread across their living room like pieces of a puzzle that had finally been assembled. Sophia was the first to break the silence. She picked up the photograph of young Rosa Martinez at Rivera's penthouse party, studying it with new eyes. "I owe you an apology," she said quietly, not looking up from the image. "We all do, but especially me. When I said you'd never done anything exciting or important." She trailed off, shaking her head. "I can't believe how wrong I was." Rosa reached over and gently took the photograph from her granddaughter's hands. "You weren't wrong, Nija. Rosa Delgado really did live a quiet life. She made dinner every Sunday, worried about homework and report cards, and found her excitement in simple things. Rosa Martinez was someone else entirely." Miguel leaned forward, his expression more serious than his 14 years usually allowed. "But they were both you. You were brave enough to be both of them." "I was terrified enough to be both of them," Rosa corrected with a small smile. Brave and terrified often look very similar from the outside. Carmen had been quiet since Chen's departure, processing not just the revelations about her mother's past, but the implications for their future. Now she stood and walked to the mantelpiece where family photos chronicled decades of birthdays, graduations, and holidays. All the moments Rosa had been present for as herself, not as someone else. "I keep thinking about all the nights you came home late," Carmen said, her back still to the room. "All the times I thought you were choosing work over family. And you were actually— what? Risking your life to protect other people's families?" "I was trying to protect our family too," Rosa said softly. "Every drug dealer we arrested, every shipment we intercepted, every piece of Rivera's organization we dismantled, it made our neighborhood safer. It made your world safer." Carmen turned around, and Rosa saw that her daughter had been crying again. "I spent so many years feeling like I wasn't important to you, like you were emotionally absent even when you were physically present." "You were the most important thing in my world," Rosa said, her voice thick with emotion. "But I couldn't show you that the way I wanted to. Every hug I gave you, every kiss goodnight, every moment of normal family life, I treasured them because I knew how easily they could be taken away. But I also had to hold part of myself back, because loving you too openly made you a target." Sophia looked up from the document she'd been examining. "Is that why you always seemed so careful? Like you were watching everything, even at family dinners?" Rosa nodded. "For 3 years, I lived every moment wondering if someone was watching me, if I'd made a mistake that would expose my family to danger. Even after the arrests, even after Rivera was in prison, I couldn't completely turn off that hypervigilance. It became part of who I was." Miguel picked up Elena's photograph, the one that had started this entire revelation. "Tell us about her again, about Elena. I want to understand why you decided to risk everything." Rosa's expression softened as she looked at the image of her murdered friend. Elena believed that ordinary people had the power to fight extraordinary evil, but only if they were willing to step outside their comfortable lives. She died for that belief, and I couldn't let her death be meaningless. "So you became Rosa Martinez to honor her memory," Carmen said, understanding beginning to dawn in her voice. "I became Rosa Martinez because Elena's death showed me that staying safe and staying silent were the same thing," Rosa replied. "And I couldn't live with the knowledge that children in our community were being destroyed, while I did nothing to stop it." Sophia had been studying Agent Chen's business card, turning it over in her hands like a talisman. "Do you regret it? Any of it?" Rosa was quiet for a long moment, considering the question with the seriousness it deserved. "I regret the cost it had on my relationship with your mother. I regret the years of distance and misunderstanding. I regret that my choices are now putting you all at risk." She paused, looking at each of them in turn. "But I don't regret helping to stop Rivera's organization. I don't regret the children who grew up safe because those drugs never made it to the streets. And I don't regret showing Elena's killers that some people can't be silenced by fear." Miguel set down Elena's photograph and reached for one of the FBI commendations Chen had shown them. "Agent Chen said you were the most valuable informant in the history of the Miami office. That's not just helping, that's being a hero. Heroes don't usually have to lie to their families for 3 years," Rosa said with a wry smile. "Maybe that's exactly what heroes have to do," Carmen said, returning to sit beside her mother. "Maybe real heroism isn't about glory and recognition. Maybe it's about making impossible choices and living with the consequences so other people don't have to." Sophia looked around at her family with new appreciation. "I can't wait to tell people at school that my grandmother is basically a retired spy." "Absolutely not," Rosa said quickly, though her tone was more amused than alarmed. "The whole point of federal protection is maintaining normal routines. That includes not announcing to your high school that you're living under FBI surveillance." Miguel grinned. "Can I at least tell Tyler that his Patagonia hiking grandmother has nothing on ours?" "You can tell Tyler that your grandmother makes excellent ropa vieja and loves her family very much," Rosa replied firmly. "The rest of this story stays in this room until Agent Chen gives us clearance to discuss it." Carmen took her mother's hand, squeezing it gently. "I have so many questions about those 3 years. About what it was really like, about the people you met, about how you managed to remember who you really were while pretending to be someone else. And I want to answer them," Rosa said. "All of them. For 40 years, I've carried these memories alone, having someone to share them with, someone who understands the full story. She paused, emotion catching in her throat. It's a gift I never expected to receive. Sophia had been reading through some of the newspaper clippings about Rivera's organization. There are so many people mentioned in these articles. Did you know what happened to all of them after the arrests? Some went to prison for decades. Some cooperated with authorities and received reduced sentences. A few fled the country and were never found. Rosa's expression grew thoughtful. Carlos Mendoza, the man I dated as Rosa Martinez, he served 8 years and then built a legitimate life for himself. Agent Chen mentioned that Rivera's people contacted him recently, but Carlos didn't give them any useful information. Miguel looked concerned. Do you think he knew? When you were dating him, do you think he suspected you were working for the FBI? Rosa considered the question carefully. I think Carlos suspected I wasn't entirely who I claimed to be. But I also think he chose not to investigate those suspicions because he genuinely cared about Rosa Martinez. Love makes people willfully blind sometimes, even when they know better. That must have been hard, Carmen said softly. Having someone care about you when you couldn't be honest about who you really were. It was the most difficult part of the entire operation, Rosa admitted. More difficult than the physical danger. More difficult than remembering my cover story. Carlos was a good man who'd made bad choices, and I had to betray his trust to serve justice. Some nights I wondered if I was becoming the kind of person who deserved the life I was living. Sophia looked up sharply. But you were protecting people. You were doing the right thing. The right thing often requires us to do things that feel wrong in the moment, Rosa said gently. That's what makes it hard to be heroic. It's not about feeling good about your choices. It's about making the necessary choices even when they cost you something precious. The room fell quiet again as everyone processed this observation. Outside, the sounds of their neighborhood continued. Children playing, dogs barking, the distant hum of traffic. Normal life carrying on around them, as it had for decades while Rosa kept her secrets. Miguel broke the silence with a question that surprised everyone. What do you need from us? I mean, we know the truth now, we understand why you did what you did. But what do you need from your family going forward? Rosa looked at her youngest grandchild with something approaching wonder. What do you mean? Quote, I mean, you've been carrying this alone for 40 years. You've been protecting us without us even knowing we needed protection. But now we know, and we want to help. So what do you need? Carmen nodded emphatically. He's right, we're a family, and families protect each other. Tell us how we can support you through whatever happens next. Sophia reached over and took Rosa's other hand. And tell us how we can learn from you. Because if there's one thing this whole experience has taught me, it's that I want to be the kind of person who stands up for what's right, even when it's scary. Rosa looked around at her family, her daughter who finally understood the sacrifices made for love, her grandchildren who were choosing courage over comfort and felt something she hadn't experienced in decades. Not just love, but the complete absence of loneliness. What I need, she said slowly, is for us to write this story down. All of it. Not just the dramatic parts, but the human parts. The fear, the doubt, the impossible choices. Elena's story, Agent Chen's dedication, even Carlos's complicated position. I need future generations of our family to understand that ordinary people can do extraordinary things when the moment demands it. Sophia's eyes lit up. Like a memoir? I could help you write it. I'm good at research, and I understand social media and digital preservation. And I could help with the historical context, Miguel added. I could research the Miami cocaine trade of the 1980s, find out what happened to the other people involved, create a complete picture of what you accomplished. Carmen squeezed her mother's hand. And I could help you process the emotional aspects. All those feelings you've been carrying alone, the guilt, the pride, the fear. We could work through them together. Rosa felt tears beginning to form in her eyes, but for the first time in this long afternoon, they were tears of joy rather than pain. Yes, she said simply. Let's tell this story properly. Let's make sure Elena's sacrifice and your strength and our family's resilience are remembered the way they deserve to be. As the sun set over their quiet Miami neighborhood, the Delgado family began planning not just how to survive the next few months of federal protection, but how to transform 40 years of secrets into a legacy of courage that would inspire generations yet to come. Outside, invisible federal agents were taking their positions, ready to protect a family that had finally learned to protect each other. And somewhere in Orlando, an old man in a wheelchair was discovering that some stories refuse to end the way their villains intend. But inside Rosa's living room, surrounded by the evidence of an extraordinary life disguised as an ordinary one, 3 generations of strong women and 1 determined young man were beginning the most important chapter of their family's story, the one where secrets became strength and truth became the foundation for everything that would follow. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us. Quote.